I'm pleased to be able to speak on behalf of the opposition on the Adelaide University Bill. I indicate that the Liberal Party will support the bill, but that support is contingent on circumstance in many ways, and I'll go through that. We do have some significant reservations about the approach that has been taken, and we are not convinced that every T has been crossed, that every I has been dotted in terms of the broader policy approach, the impact on the sector, and whether the approach the government has taken nails it for the people of South Australia. On balance, the support the opposition is providing to the bill and the process is also partly in the context that this is a process that's going ahead. It's been clearly going ahead ever since the Honourable Sarah Game from One Nation, Connie Benares, the Honourable Connie Benares from the Legislative Council of SA Best, stood with the government, did a press conference confirming their support for the bill. At that moment, the bill was going to pass. University is going to be created. Its structures will be in place in order for it to seek TEXA registration early next year. It will be seeking to advertise to attract international students to come to South Australia for courses beginning on the 1st of January 2026, when the new institution is to formally commence its existence. And in that context, this employer of more than 8,000 staff, as it will be, the educator of some 60, potentially as many as 70,000 students in the long term, as we hope it will be, this significant institution for South Australia's trade and investment future, potentially attracting, hopefully, more than 5,000 extra international students over the thousands that the two institutions currently do. Such a significant role in South Australia's economy and future, and also our research base, tackling the challenges that confront us in South Australia particularly, but around the world, in our lives, in our scientific development, in our health sciences, in our defence needs. This institution, sir, is going to happen as a result of that support in the Legislative Council. It's an institution that must succeed. In that context, sir, the opposition will do what we can to support its success. We will highlight areas where we believe that the government has not necessarily crossed those T's and dotted those I's, and put in place measures to ensure its success beyond all reasonable doubt. We will advocate for improvements to the process that the government has spoken about. The impact on Flinders University, for example, of the creation of a perpetual fund for Adelaide University that does not also support our state's second university. The impact upon residents in the community around McGill, for example, as a consequence of the whatever the government chooses to do with the land sale that is wrapped up in this process. And, of course, the direct support that the government is providing to the Adelaide University and the obligations it is requiring of Adelaide University in order to manage that transition process. Through the next course of this debate, and indeed over the next 2.5 years, the opposition will put forward our concerns, our suggestions. We will highlight opportunities where we believe the matter can be improved. We will urge the government to take those on board. And, should they not, there will be opportunities after March 2026, indeed for the opposition, to put in place some of those improvements when we form government, should the people of South Australia give us that opportunity and that honour. The range of work that has gone into this bill over not just months but years, I articulated at some length last sitting week, sir, when this Parliament was noting the Joint Committee into the establishment of an Adelaide University Select Committee process. Members who are interested, as the Deputy Premier was intently throughout that lengthy speech, will be able to reflect on some of the points I made then. Some of them bear repeating in the context of this bill, but I don't propose to go into as much detail in this contribution as I did then. For the record, I would certainly consider anybody who is looking into the Liberal Party's point of view on these matters to look at my reflections during the last sitting week, side by side with this speech. If anyone is trawling through Hansard for some postdoctoral thesis in years ahead, I'm wondering how the university is established and what the opposition's point of view was at the time, this speech ain't going to be enough. There is a wealth of primary source material available to such a scholar, and I encourage them towards it. Spread over multiple days and 5 separate sessions. It was bears investigation, sir. In the second reading speech, the Deputy Premier said, as did the Attorney-General when he introduced it into the Legislative Council a couple of weeks ago, reflecting on a difference between the situation now with the universities seeking an opportunity to merge compared to 2018. And it was a mistake when the Attorney-General said it, and it was a mistake when the Deputy Premier said it. They suggest that the only difference between the approach from 2018 and the approach from 2022 is the level of interest and support from government in doing so. I note first that the Attorney-General and the Deputy Premier only choose 2018 as their comparator, as if the approaches that had been made towards merger some 5 or 6 earlier than that, and 5 or 6 years earlier than that, and so on, going back to the late 90s, almost every time of which the Labor Party was in power, had not gone ahead. The criticisms that the government has made of the former Liberal government, if they were valid, could be equally applied to any former Labor government as well. But more than that, there's an inaccuracy in the question of whether the former government was interested and whether that approach from the former government was what caused the university merger pathway to fail in 2018. There is just no evidence of that. Well, there was witness testimony from one witness during the Joint Parliamentary Committee, which I think would be charitably described as hearsay evidence from somebody who was peripheral to the issue at the time, who purported to report on conversations with somebody involved in the Liberal government at the time. I tell you, I was the Minister for Education. I met with David Lloyd and Peter Rathjen on a number of occasions when they were presenting their vision for what could happen, and at every moment, whether it was the Premier, to my understanding, or certainly in my own discussions with them, the former government was respectful, courteous, interested, and awaiting further information as to what they thought would be necessary from government if such a proposal was to proceed. The Vice-Chancellors and the Chancellors and the University Councils did not reach the point where they were able to put forward such a proposition because in the meantime the University Councils chose not to proceed. They did not wish to, and their circumstances, it should be said, were different. Because one of the key reasons why the universities have sought government investment to enable this to take place is because of the financial situation cumulatively of the two universities, which is entirely different now to what it was in 2018. So whether the Deputy Premier, I suspect the Deputy Premier remembers, I suspect the Attorney-General remembers, but whether they've they have noted that there was a pandemic between 2020 and 2022 and drawn the link between that pandemic and the financial security and financial base of our universities is not apparent from their second reading contributions. It's more than public knowledge. It's been broadcast in so many different ways, the extraordinary challenge that our universities faced during the pandemic. Staff in their hundreds were laid off from Adelaide University. The future prospectus on international students was slashed by the pandemic. The extraordinary thing about the numbers of international students in the pandemic actually was that we managed to keep so many. There were a large number of students who continued being enrolled and studying remotely from China and other parts of the world while not actually being able to attend in Australia. And they maintained their enrolment in large numbers and were able to complete degrees here, or some are still here, having commenced their studies while studying remotely. But I tell you what, the numbers that we have now and the numbers that we've had over the last couple of years compared to prior to the pandemic have been slashed, sir, and it is still a sector that is recovering. The nature of those studies is also recovering. Of course, during the intervening period, people have formed different study habits. We are transitioning more towards a heavier focus on postgraduate work being done in international students as a proportion of the mix compared to undergraduates who do their whole degrees here. It was a 2-year pause where nobody knew was coming into Australia, sir, and that had an impact in the hundreds of millions of dollars on our universities' bottom lines. There was a different federal funding mix in 2018 to that which exists now. The importance of international students was there in 2018. It is more important now. And there are questions, sir, on whether that will change as a result of the Australian Universities Accord process, which is as yet incomplete. I'll get to the Accord. But in relation to the government investment, in 2018, the ask of universities, had we reached that point, I suspect would have been much more modest. And there was certainly no discouragement from the government in terms of pursuing that. It's just that the universities decided they didn't want to. There are a range of reasons that have been posited as to why that might be the case. The university councils have kept their own council, if you'll forgive the duplication. But as Education Minister, in all of the discussions that I've had with Chancellors, Vice-Chancellors, Deputy Vice-Chancellors or others between 2018 and 2022, I didn't hear any of them blaming us. For the new government to say that that was the difference is a nonsense. We have always said from the Liberal Party's point of view that we'd be willing to facilitate a merger and support a merger based on 2 factors. Firstly, the universities going into this willingly, voluntarily, not being forced into it because governments, ministers or premiers decided that it was the thing to do because it was their vibe, that was how they felt, and they were going to make it happen. Look tough, look strong, universities just get in line. That wouldn't have been adequate. We, of course, have had a significant process over the last year and a half now where these universities have determined at their leadership level at least, through their councils, through their vice-chancellors, through their chancellors, this is something they wish to pursue, that they consider to be in the institution's interests, in the state's interests, and we take them at their word. They've made that very clear, and they've explained the process they've gone to come to that landing. So that satisfies the first of the Liberal Party's 2 questions as to whether we would support the legislation. The second aspect is whether it's in the state's interests. That's a big question. It's a question I'm sure the Deputy Premier turned her mind to at great length in opposition and upon forming government. And I'm not going to dwell too long on the question of the election commitment, but I must say that the opposition's election commitment, which was for a commission to effectively seek an answer to this question of what was in the state's best interests, the fact that the government chose not to go down that path but instead to operate directly with the universities does leave that question requiring thoughtful consideration to come up with an answer. What is in the state's best interests? And, I mean, throughout this process, there's been a lot of questions asked that inform that. Is it in the institution's interests? The councils say yes, many of the staff say no. Students have gone both ways, but probably more are saying yes than no. And the union says no. The Joint Committee looked into this. The majority view was a decision that they said, and I use they because I've clearly outed myself by having a minority report as a member of the minority, sir. But the majority has said that on the balance of the evidence received, the committee considers that the economic and social interests of the state of South Australia would likely be advanced by the amalgamation of the University of Adelaide, the University of South Australia, into the new Adelaide University. The minority, of which I was a member at least, put it somewhat differently. We formed a view that on the balance of the evidence considered by the committee, the economic and social interests of the state of South Australia might be advanced by proposed amalgamation. Members should note these opportunities carry with them a number of considerable risks that need to be mitigated. We believe that while informed members acting in good faith could reasonably conclude that the risks inherent in the proposal are worth taking or not, we suggest that measures presented elsewhere in the report are essential if the proposal were to succeed, and we suggested further measures. This question then is also about not just the economic and social impacts on the state, but what else do universities do? Universities as institutions are behemoths. They are not only substantial employers, they don't only have a substantial impact on our economy immediately, but they also establish a framework for our culture as a state and our education of our professional class that then has an impact for decades hence. If you are working in a range of professions around South Australia, chances are you're taking an approach to your teaching or your doctoring or your lawyering or your engineering or the science that you're pursuing that is founded significantly on the way you interacted with the university when you were at it. I studied in the mid-1990s to the late 1990s, and of course I can't help but still be influenced by the approach that, actually I should say the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. I can't help but be influenced by the skills and the knowledge and the dispositions that I learnt during that time at university, from the way that my professors and teachers and tutors that supported my education. We had for decades education schools, not just in South Australia, around Australia, that weren't teaching teachers how to do early reading instruction using phonics, which it turns out is really important. And consequently, that had an impact on the way that many teachers for a long time, until the last decade or so, certainly the last 6 or 7 years, have been implementing early literacy instruction in classrooms. My point is that the economic and social impacts identified by the committee report, and which I think the Deputy Premier's focus was in her speech, they're not the only impacts of universities. Our universities are tremendously important. Relevant to the bill because the bill unlocks some significant investments by the state government into the university sector is the investment in other parts of the education and training system as well. I noted last week we had the AGM and the convention of the Apprentice Employment Network here in South Australia, and the Minister for Education was talking about the tremendously important role that skills and training, the work of RTOs and GTOs, has on our future workforce needs. And the way in which we fund and support training and the university sector in this country are very different from each other, and there's an intentionality to that, but there's also a series of historical accidents that have led us to this point. Some might say that there is a class, a group that go to university that have this tremendously worthwhile HECS process. That means you can study anything and pay it back to the taxpayer when you are earning a certain amount, and that's an extraordinarily generous gift to what was traditionally the middle class or the wealthier classes in Australia. And over a series of decades, we wanted to support upward mobility. We wanted to enable every young person to find the thing that will enable them to thrive in life and enjoy their life. And so we pitched very hard and we worked very hard to ensure that every young person knew that they too could succeed, they too could have a university education. And one of the points the Minister for Education made in his speech last week, which I agree with, it's right, is that in our noble cause to ensure that there was social mobility and that no child would see themselves cut off from being able to be a doctor or a lawyer, an engineer or anything that required a university degree, we devalued the skills and training sector at the same time. We almost made it as if the only kids who should be doing an apprenticeship or a traineeship or vet education should be those for whom an ATAR was out of reach. The Minister framed it a bit differently, but I hope he won't mind me paraphrasing. And that's had negative consequences on our community too, sir. Because it turns out that for the young person, their experience of school education might be similar to other kids at school. There's a certain level of uniformity, at least to some of the subjects that are studied. But then the pathways out of school, whether it's a traineeship, an apprenticeship, vet and then work, going directly to work, or going to university and then onwards, those are a whole wide range of different experiences. But the university sector is privileged in many ways in the government investment. We do that because, of course, there are significant costs to some of those things that we have at university. But I do think that as a society, we need to work really hard with our schools, with our families, public education campaigns to families, to ensure that when a young person is in year 7, 8 and 9, that junior secondary years at school, they are presented with every opportunity to find a pathway that is going to suit their aspirations, their aptitudes, their dispositions, and the job market that's going to be ahead of them. It may well be that a class at any school might have half of the kids that would be fantastic in a university pathway, and 40% who will be fantastic in a vet pathway, and 10% whose the things that they're interested in, they can just go straight to work after school, and that's great. But we've got to work harder to get that right, and we can't just assume that university or trades are better, because they're both tremendously important, and many of the young people doing one or the other will end up in the other, potentially using both towards their careers. I say that in the context of the investment that is coming with this and the impact that funding a university or forcing two big institutions like this to merge will have on our society. It's a substantial one. This university, as a merged institution, will be responsible for the education not just of researchers and conducting research that will be important to South Australia's economy, and not just educating the international students whose economic impact and the social impact of those international students was probably a large portion of the work of the Joint Parliamentary Committee to the establishment of Adelaide University. It's also going to be the educator of the majority of our professionals in South Australia. And so from the first graduating class in 2026 of the new university so merged, or more likely the first graduating classes of 2028-29, when students will have only been doing their studies under the new university, through the 2030s, the 2040s, the 2050s and the 2060s and so on. We are creating an educational landscape that will be different from what we have now, and that means there will be a new school of education that will replace the two schools of education at the moment. Those two schools of education, for example, turn out teachers who have higher levels of expertise or understanding or reputation in one area or another. Adelaide University's focus has been on high schools. The University of South Australia, as in many ways, has had a really strong practical application of their approach to learning. And the proposition before us will create a new school of education. And we don't know what that's going to look like yet, sir. And that's okay. And I'm an optimistic person. And as an opposition, we're supporting the bill. We want this to be a success. It has to be a success for our state. It's going to be too big to fail. But my point is that there's a risk that if the new institution's approach to its building of a school of education, which is the work's starting from the ground up now, if they get it wrong, if their emphasis sways too much to one trend or another fashion, then that will be a disaster. Now, I think they've got the people to get it right. School of Education I choose because it's an easy one to demonstrate the impact of that profession on our state. 70% of the teachers going into our schools every year are going to come out of this institution. That's 700 plus teachers every year. There's about 1,000 teachers that are employed by the Department for Education every year. Another 500 by independent and Catholic schools around South Australia. So, potentially hundreds and hundreds and hundreds are going to come out of this new institution. And are they going to have the world-class skill set? Well, we certainly hope so, and we will do everything we can to support them make it happen. It's no reflection on the staff who are there, by the way. It's a complicating factor that we're asking two sets of educators, the deans of the education in the two different universities. They're going to now be working together to create something new, because they've been doing things a bit differently up to now from each other, and they're proud of that, and they should be, because they're excellent at what they do. And creating something new creates questions of culture. The Deputy Premier, in her speech, I noted, and I hope I'm accurately reflecting this, she said, "The bill combines the strengths of the University of South Australia and the University of Adelaide." And a new institution doesn't get created in terms of its strengths through a bill. The bill can set out that we want this institution to pursue social outcomes, and we do. We want it to pursue economic outcomes, and we do. But ultimately, culture and policy, funding, circumstances will be also required to work in our favour for the strengths of the University of South Australia and the strengths of the University of Adelaide to both be reflected in the new institution. I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful that it'll all work out, but confident? No. We've got to put in place as many risk mitigations as we can along the way. Now, we're supported in that by the strength of leadership at the universities, and I thank and recognise the work that has gone on in the University of Adelaide, the University of South Australia towards developing this proposal. That goes to the members of the Council, senior administration, the Vice-Chancellors, the Chancellors, and so many others. I also, in that sense, think that it has been a hugely important part of this process, the work that has been done by those who are sceptical and outright opposed to this proposal. Because going back to the government's election commitment to have a commission that would have done that investigative work, when the universities went to the government saying, actually, you've got this proposal and we think that actually we'd like to merge, would that be satisfactory to the government in terms of seeing its own election commitment fulfilled? And the government went down this path. And we didn't have a commission, but it also meant we didn't have that policy framework considered that government departments would usually do for a new proposal. There is within government, it's sort of understood that the simplest way to identify whether the government should do something is whether it was an election policy. The government should do its election policies. It should implement its election policies. That's its job before everything else. So the minority report that the Honourable Jing Lee and I wrote reflected on this question of whether it was an election commitment. I don't believe that it is an exact reflection of the election commitment. It is certainly cogent to the election commitment. The merger is a potential outcome of the delivery of the election commitment. But having skipped the step of the analysis, we firmly believed that other analysis needed to take its place if there wasn't going to be a commission. And through the Joint Committee report, it became apparent that no substantial analysis had been undertaken by government other than in certain specific circumstances. The Department for Treasury did a body of work on what was necessary in order to enable the universities to have confidence in merging, that they weren't going to reach their floor of what financial reserves they were comfortable in having. Those financial reserves having been diminished during the pandemic, obviously. And so they required more government investment to keep them afloat during the transition period, which carried significant risks. So the Treasury Department's focus was very much on that financial question. They talked about effectively negotiating with the universities as to what was necessary. The universities wanted a grant that would have enabled them to proceed without risk. The Vice-Chancellors were, I thought, pretty eloquent and cutting to the point on this during evidence they gave. They would have questions about the nature of the perpetual funds. The University Vice-Chancellor said, well, we would be happy to have a grant, replace the need for a perpetual fund, and then we could create our own perpetual funds. But the government's approach, which potentially, well, it certainly makes things easier for the books in the short to medium term, was to set up funds within Treasury. Now, we haven't complained about this process. Indeed, we've reflected in the Liberal Party's election commitment we've already made to establish a research fund for Flinders that pretty good chance we'd use a similar mechanism. We'll investigate it further. But by the capital staying on the government's books, it doesn't affect the budget bottom line other than that of the earnings from that capital no longer being in government hands but being dispersed to the universities, which I think will be $12 million a year, although the Minister might correct me if I'm mistaken. But $12 million a year plus, hopefully forever. That investment was worked through with Treasury. The second department involved was the Department of Innovation and Science, the higher education unit, which reports to the Deputy Premier within that department, Industry, Innovation and Science, I should say. And that department's work was focused on the drafting of the bill, as best I could tell. Working with the universities, the leadership of the universities, the Deputy Premier in her office and possibly the Premier in his office, certainly within government, to identify what's the nature of the bill, what do we want on it. There was a public consultation process with a draft bill. There were reflections from the Joint Committee in relation to the Accord and reviews after the Accord. The composition of council was slightly changed. There were some other matters that came up through the public consultation process. The Department of Industry, Innovation and Skills, in managing that, has brought us this bill. We also asked the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science officers whether any other policy work had been done, for example, on whether this was a good idea, whether it was in the interests of the people of South Australia to proceed with this project. And the answer was that, effectively, that work had been done by the university councils, and considering whether or not it was a good idea. And the Deputy Premier and I have spoken about this in the chamber before, but ultimately it's, again, worth restating. The University Council's job is to identify what they perceive as in the best interests of their institutions. Government's job is to identify what's in the best interests of the state and seek to implement it. And that too is the Parliament's job. It highlights the importance of the work of having had that joint parliamentary committee, and indeed, I think that it goes to why while we will be supportive of the aspirations, we'll be supportive of trying to unlock the potential that this bill could create, this new institution could create, we still hold those reservations. And at every turn, we urge the government to be mindful of that and to be keeping a close eye on it, to be identifying what supports the universities may need, what obligations might be sought of them to ensure that the opportunities here are realised and not the risks. One of the other questions in relation to whether it's in the state's best interests. Firstly, there's the economic question, the social question. The committee identified that they thought that on balance it was likely that our interests will be served here. That's based on certain propositions. Propositions such as the increase in international students that's potentially able to be realised, the efficiency of having two administrations brought into one, and so investments can be made with that in mind, and there's a certain efficiency that comes from that that would be ideally applied into increased research. The example was given during the committee stages that both of the universities have spent some $300 million in recent years on new health science type research facilities. If there had been one institution rather than two, it's likely you might have spent $500 million on one extra especially good institution rather than two really good $300 million institutions, and you would have saved $100 million that could have been applied into the work that goes on inside the building. And that's not a bad point. So the efficiency argument in terms of this merger is not that you're going to save on ongoing costs from what's there at the moment, because they're seeking to grow the whole scale of the thing, but they're seeking to find efficiencies going forward in one large IT procurement rather than, one monstrously large IT procurement rather than two just monstrously large IT procurements. And there may well be a saving there. I suspect it'll take a while to realise it, but over the course of decades, I'm sure we'll get there. The application of these extra funds that will be realised by the efficiency is designed to be invested in research. Indeed, having the scale of the two universities together is designed to accentuate the research opportunities created here. The member for Gibson in her speech talked about the example of cancer biology, where you have two teams of scientists who gave evidence to the committee that they want to work together, that they like to work together. They work together now, but it'll be better to have one swipe card rather than two swipe cards, so having the merger will benefit them in doing so. The benefits there for the state could be significant. It'll be supported by the investment of the $200 million Perpetual Research Fund. I might mention it here, it may come up again later, but the perpetual nature of that research fund going to one institution, not the other, creates a risk about whether or not staff from Flinders might be attracted to move, which means there would be no net benefit to the state. But in its ideal form, what you will have is maybe potential graduates from Adelaide University or University of South Australia who are doing their work interstate or overseas, and they're excellent and they're the sort of top quality researchers that we need. They might be incentivised by this investment to come home to Adelaide along with other people who are seeking to make Adelaide their home. And why wouldn't they? This is the best place in the world to live. These people are really in demand. They could live anywhere in the world, but the investment from the government is designed to help attract them here. And as those top quality researchers are attracted here, and as the University of Adelaide seeks to retain those that it already has who are performing at that level, partly supported by this new investment from government, then the plan is that the ranking of the university rises. Now, this is a very much Adelaide University of Adelaide focused part of the question, because the University of South Australia, to be clear, is an excellent university, and I think it's the best in Australia, potentially the best in the world at some of the things it does. But its ranking is lower than Adelaide University's, because rankings are mostly based on research intensity and the volume of high quality research in particular. The investment of the merging of the universities will bring some of the researchers from the University of South Australia who would be in that category to the University of Adelaide. The transition process may see some retire or leave, and there'd be a risk there. But ultimately, the new money and the new efficiencies that will further unlock new money is supposed to buy in extra researchers that can help lift our ranking from where Adelaide Uni is at the moment, which is on the cusp of top 100, but probably on a slight downward trajectory. Now, under the model of the merger, Adelaide University's ranking in the medium to long term will be able to be secured within the top 100. And if university is in the top 100 on an ongoing basis, then its attractiveness to international students is much enhanced. Adelaide University has at the moment about 30% of its students being international students, and they pay a higher annual fee for that privilege than do the 20% of University of South Australia students, or thereabouts, who are international students. And that is a function of rankings. The basis for the economic modelling, a large amount of it is predicated on the idea that an extra merged university would be able to have closer to Adelaide University's proportion of international students, because it would be at an attractive ranking point enough. That Adelaide University itself would be able to still deliver teaching to the quality and the appeal that the universities want by keeping it under 30% international students, but that extra volume they could have would be an extra 5,000 to 7,000 students, and that those students would be effectively able to be charged the premium prices that Adelaide University is able to charge as a top 100 institution. There are parts of the world where the ranking of the university from where your degree comes has an enormous difference to your quality of life. Australia isn't really one of those places. In Australia, if the members of this House went to University of Adelaide, University of South Australia, Flinders University, TAFE, to institutions interstate, or apprenticeships, indeed, in South Australia and Australia, we're relatively egalitarian in that way. But there are countries in the world where there are cities that you can only really move to if you're bringing a skill set based on that thing of rankings, and that makes it extraordinarily appealing to potential international students to have a top 100 university, as Adelaide has usually been in the past. So goes the model: extra international students, extra income for Adelaide, and that also can be applied to further research, which is able to help increase our ranking and improve our ranking, which is able to be attractive to international students who are able to pay more money into the university, which are able to then apply it into research, and it goes on and on. And on that basis, the University of Adelaide would counsel, I certainly can see the economic draw for them in pursuing this approach. For the University of South Australia, it is clear that the University of South Australia is going into this, not merger, but this new institution as an equal partner. and the strengths of the University of South Australia in terms of its reputation as a world-class teaching university, alongside quality research in a smaller number of fields, are able to, in an ideal world, be drawn out. The strong online programs that UniSA has, while hopefully they won't be to the detriment of strong face-to-face delivery of courses as well in the future, but the University of South Australia is well regarded for its online capability, alongside graduate satisfaction, employer satisfaction with graduates of the University of South Australia, and its success in reaching students from backgrounds that haven't been university educated in the past. Flinders University is good at all of these things too, by the way, but we'll come to Flinders a bit later. So the University of South Australia, coming into it as an equal partner, its graduates will get a Group of 8 certificate on their parchment, whereas previously they didn't. Now that is something that is a nice to have, it's not necessarily a must have. I suspect for many of their graduates they won't really mind either way. But it's certainly a nice to have. It's, people can point to their CV and say, I came from one of the top 8 institutions in Australia. We hope that as Flinders gets close to the top 10, all of our graduates will have that opportunity. I guess for the University of South Australia, the bigger thing that would probably be attractive to council members is they have significant plans to continue expanding what they do, continue improving the work that they do, and the funding potentially realised by this merger may enable them to speed up those plans. So that goes towards the opportunity and why the councils of the universities considered it in their economic benefit to do it. And from the state's point of view, both research and international students are important for our economy and for social benefit too. International students don't just spend money at the university through their course fees. They live here, they pay rent, they pay for food. They do part-time work in many, many cases, helping provide workforce in an economy that needs a workforce boost like no tomorrow. International students work inside communities, they volunteer inside our communities. During bushfires in the 2019-20 summer, there were international students in amongst the community groups that provided support to families who had lost their homes. You know, the benefit of having international students in your community is broad. They also spend money at our tourist destinations. Their families come and visit them, particularly from some markets. Their families come and live with them on occasions and spend money in our economy. There was once, I guess, a question mark that some people in the community had over whether housing and potential jobs, potential university spaces were taken up by international students that would otherwise be going to domestic students. And I think that that's mostly been put to bed over the years. I think broadly this, everyone's understanding is more sophisticated than it might once have been. International students are an unambiguous good for South Australia, and we like having them here. I'd like to see more of them able to successfully pursue migration outcomes. And I don't think we should be ashamed to tell the federal government that that's an important part of what we're seeking to achieve in South Australia, because the challenges for our workforce needs are different to those in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, perhaps, where there might be more strain put on communities. International students also tend to have different accommodation preferences to people who have grown up in Australia, and so those accommodation preferences are not necessarily, or not even usually, competing in the same space. So let's assume that these extra international students are an unambiguous social and economic good for the state as well as for the institutions. Then turn our minds to research. Now this is one where there is as much risk as any factor in the merger, because you'll recall me saying that the benefits for research were largely in terms of new investments that can be made. And those new investments can be made through extra profits for the universities from international students being able to be applied into areas of intensive research. It can be applied through the savings and efficiencies made through having one institution rather than two, not having the double bureaucracies within the institution, although you know, I don't know too many experiences where combining two institutions' bureaucracies has ended up having a smaller bureaucracy than the two combined. But let's assume that examples such as the saving of the money in the health science building could be applied in perpetuity, and there would be some money saved there. And then there's the perpetual fund from the government. So there's extra money for research. But it doesn't follow without risk that will necessarily mean that the research effort will improve. There's certainly the building blocks and the foundations. In an ideal world it will. But there's risks here too, because here's the thing. Adelaide University's ranking has been put to the committee on a number of occasions. It's based on the output of those top 200 researchers, and questions have been asked about, how do you apply extra funding? You can fund teams, you can fund work. Really, the most significant area that you'd often be putting the extra money is in human capital, the extraordinarily unique individuals who discover the vaccines, who discover how to do x-rays in a new and exciting way, who discover the over-the-horizon radar that protects our country. Those unique individuals that are at another level, and it is a cost to attract them to our city and their state. These are people who could work at any university in the world if they wanted to live in a certain city. Attracting them is a special proposition, and some of them, a good number of them, are here now. And not every single one of them, sir, is a massive fan of this process. So there is a risk about losing some of the people we have. The committee report goes into the risk, and particularly in the minority report, Jingli and I talk about this risk, and a number of witnesses put in evidence about this. I said earlier in my speech that my gratitude to the people who'd put work into the committee was significant, because it's only by addressing concerns, including by the sceptics, that we're able to maximise our chance of this institution's success. The risk of them leaving because they're not happy and they can get jobs elsewhere needs to be a factor in the Vice-Chancellors, the University Councils and the government's mind as we proceed, because if a group of them leave, if a large group of them leave, then that has a bigger short-term impact, short to medium-term impact on the university's ranking. And you'll recall, sir, that the whole proposition of the virtuous circle of the funding, the research, the rankings, the international students going round and round, if that breaks, if you don't get the ranking improvement because the transition cost has been too much, if you don't have the funding that then will come from the international students that will be attracted by that ranking, then you don't have that funding to invest in the research, then you don't get the benefits. We've got to be mindful of that. Now, the Vice-Chancellors of the University of Adelaide and University of South Australia, Professor Peter Hoy and Professor David Lloyd, were really good to engage with the opposition after the minority report and highlighted some of the recruitments they've been able to undertake in recent times, certainly since, including in this year, highlighting that at the same time as there may or may not be numbers of people planning on leaving, they are still continuing to recruit. They've been recruiting from top-level universities. We've got a head of the Department for Education, for example, who's come to us from Oxford University, who is outstanding. And there's a number of others. That this is a focus for them is clear. It must be a focus for them. And I appreciate their energies in reaching out to the opposition and providing us with further evidence of extra work they're putting in to mitigate this risk. A range of other suggestions that were put forward through the Joint Committee in the establishment of University of Adelaide, or Adelaide University I should say, and we'll certainly be urging the government to invest in those. So much for research. Now, the benefits of the research, if this goes well, are significant, because it's not just about the rankings. The rankings are infuriating in some ways, because the rankings don't define what a university is good at, other than in limited categories that the rankings agencies are interested in. But they're so important for the international students that they can't be denied. But research taking place at a high quality level is important in our state. The commercialisation of research, the connection between businesses and startups and major primes and work going on in our universities can't be understated. Less than a kilometre from here, or maybe it's a kilometre from here at Lot 14, you have world-leading aeronautical, defence, cyber and space companies who are attracted to work in Lot 14, not just because of their proximity to the Cyber Collaboration Centre, brought to South Australia by the Marshall Liberal Government, by the Australian Space Agency, brought to South Australia by the Marshall Liberal Government, the Australian Institute of Machine Learning, brought by the Adelaide University, and indeed so many other wonderful opportunities at Lot 14, all next to each other. But they are keen to work in collaboration with our universities, and indeed Flinders and Adelaide and UniSA all have their own programs working with these major defence companies and others. That collaboration is really important. It's also important to facilitate the commercialisation from within. And whether it's in areas critical to South Australia's economy, like agricultural technology and food production, our defence needs and the AUKUS opportunities that we have as a state in shipbuilding, and missiles and radar and other warfare capabilities, and health sciences, which is a major focus for all three of our universities when it comes to research. By seeking to solve issues and create opportunities through research that is relevant to the South Australian context, we also maximise the opportunities for businesses in those areas to thrive here in South Australia. And we maximise the opportunities for our students, our undergraduate students, to work with those businesses in those areas here in South Australia. The work that our universities do is more than just teaching, and it's more than just research, but there is also a particular collaboration between teaching and research that it's been put to me by a couple of people is also part of the exciting thing about this merger, because as the merger seeks to have a new institution that is building its curriculum, the way in which it might be able to integrate exposure to some of those special research fields in the delivery of undergraduate courses, not just postgraduate courses, is potentially quite exciting and could really lift what is on offer for our students. Has an impact on the social and economic fortunes for this state. So, coming back to the Joint Committee's report, when the Joint Committee identified, as it put, on the balance of evidence received, the committee considers the economic and social interests of the state of South Australia would likely be advanced by the amalgamation of the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia. They said would likely be. It's a judgment call, sir. It's a subjective call. I think they certainly could be. And if the opportunities that I've described are realised, then it will. But they're not the only things that need to be considered. Now, the university councils will have given considerations to some of those broader educational questions. I talked about the School of Education before. There are two law schools at the two universities. There are humanities crossovers between the two courses. There are multiple areas of duplication. Now, we've been told that everyone's going to be continuing on and working together, certainly through to 2027. As they're building these courses together, there's a range of areas that are going to be really interesting. Now, for those in our community who have been to university, the question of what should their university be doing, what should they be focusing on, is always going to be significantly influenced by what they studied and what their experiences were. Somebody learnt to be an accountant at Adelaide University or University of South Australia, so probably that's going to have a very strong perspective on what they think an accounting school should look like. And what if you were to tell them that actually the other university focuses almost entirely on different course material to what their university did? The other university doesn't really value the things that they felt to be important in their career as an accountant or a business manager or a local government official or a politician. The things that they found useful, the other university does differently. And then those guys are all going to have to come together and build a course. That's a complexity. I think about the ways in which schools, disciplines within the university come together as a risk point, potentially an opportunity point. Maybe these brilliant minds, as they are, working together will come up with something better than the sum of their parts. And I hope that's the case. And there's a lot of investment going into this. But the idea that we're going forward here without risk is something that not a lot of public policy work has gone into in the course of this debate. And I think that's a shame. But we put now, as a parliament, our trust in the leadership of the universities to get it right. Now, they're brilliant people, and they'll apply themselves to this diligently and expertly, but it behoves the government to keep an eye on how it's going so that we can, at each turn, identify where there are specific areas of risk that attention needs to be paid to. One of those areas of risk comes then in the form of the funding arrangements. Now, the Joint Committee heard evidence early on from Professor Bebbington, former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, and others in relation to the reforms that the federal government currently has underway into the accord process. This was an important consideration. It was put to the Vice-Chancellors whether this was a concern, and it was not for them. And it was not necessarily a concern for Professor Mary O'Kane either, who's the chair of that accord process, who also presented to the committee, and she's a former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide. That doesn't mean that all of the concern around this has necessarily been assuaged, because it's got to be noted that, we're talking about a process of federal funding that is one of the most significant potential impacts on the future of this university as well. The impacts of the accord, to put it into context, the impacts of funding changes that might exist on the accord could be substantially more dramatic than the impacts of funding coming from the state government's investment in the $300 million perpetual funds, the $320 million perpetual funds. When the federal government changes at any point university funding structures, that has a big impact on the business of universities. Now, that accord process and the timing of it is really critical here. And I foreshadow to the Minister that we'll be spending a little bit of time when we get into committee on looking at what is expected of the review process that will be coming after the accord is finished. Because the timing is awkward here, to say the least. When the government signed heads of agreement with the Adelaide Uni and Uni SA Vice-Chancellors or Chancellors in early July, and the Greens and Frank Pangello and the Liberal Party advocated for a review of this whole matter in the Parliament because the policy work hadn't been done, we advocated for a longer process. The government said no, 3 months, and they were supported in their arrangements with One Nation and Connie Benares in the Legislative Council to have an abbreviated committee that lasted for 3 months. The government has always, and it's been consistent in this, said they want to do it this year. The most compelling evidence as to why this needed to be finished this year, for my mind, comes from two sources. One being TEXA. TEXA said that they would work towards getting accreditation for the 1st of July next year if the legal process was finished early next year, but it would be harder to guarantee than if it was this year. And the second one being the Vice-Chancellors, who made the point that the senior staff in the University of Adelaide and University of South Australia have been working on merger now for a while, over a year, and that's prevented them from working on other core business because you're just only so many hours in the day. And that other core business is stuff that people at Flinders University and their competitors in state continue to work on, while senior staff and heads of discipline at Adelaide Uni and Uni SA are working on transition planning. And so, for all of those reasons, the earlier they could get an answer, the better. The Vice-Chancellor said they needed an answer in the first quarter of next year, but earlier would be preferable. And so we are working to this timeline. I expect this bill will be completed this week. This speech will be finished today. But the consequence of rushing must be taken into consideration too. And if somebody says, are we really rushing it? It's taken a year and a half. You've got to take into account the whole federal funding matrix for universities is probably going to change next year. And what that's going to look like, we'll have a much better idea a couple of months hence than we do now, to the point where there's going to be a review of the legislation after the federal accord process has been finished, because it's been identified as an issue. It's an issue that's been dismissed by some. It's been an issue that's been said is the be-all and end-all by others. The truth may be somewhere in the middle, or it may not, but it behoves this Parliament to really seriously take into consideration what would be the consequence of if the new federal funding model that was to be put in place after the Accord process provided benefits to smaller institutions for having a smaller specialisation. What would be the consequence if there were new regulations that impacted on how funding from international students was able to be used to cross-subsidise research or other aspects of universities' existence? Those are serious matters that have been raised through the Accord process and highlighted to the committee. And I think the basis on which they've been dismissed has been that the chair of the Accord process, Mary O'Kane, and the Federal Minister for Education, Jason Clare, have given the state government sufficient comfort for the state government's needs that they think that a new merged university will be okay in a post-Accord transition. There's no detail on how it will be okay because there's no detail on what reforms the Accord will put in place. Nevertheless, I am persuaded that a decision should be reached on this merger one way or the other sooner rather than later, because otherwise the risk is to Adelaide Uni and UniSA, their senior leadership are distracted from their jobs for an ongoing period of time. The significant number of hours every single week that these academics and professional staff at the university, and academics who are working professional staff at university now, have been putting into this process is dramatic. They can't do that for the next 18 months and expect to see no impact on the ongoing work at their universities, and I absolutely accept that. But we will need to spend some time considering how the Accord process may have an impact. What reassurances the state government may have had from the federal government, other than those that are in the public arena, about what the nature of the Accord outcomes are going to look like. Can't help but look at the experience of a brilliant man such as, and I use brilliant in terms of clear intellectual powerhouse, someone like Glyn Davis, whose work at Melbourne University, which has been highlighted as a large, successful, thriving university. You know what? Glyn Davis has said some things on the record about the benefits of smaller institutions too. He's going to have a pretty profound impact on what the federal government does, given his role within the federal government, I would have thought. So it'll be really a key question for the state government to focus on. It's a risk that really the state government, as they talk to their federal Labor colleagues, are in a position to mitigate in a way that the universities are not necessarily, because it'll be a political question for the federal parliament what reforms they end up putting in place and the impact that'll have potentially on our institution here in South Australia. So that's an area of risk that needs to be understood and considered as we do this. Now, there is a risk in the status quo that I suspect is not as well understood as might be the case. And why would it be? Because we don't want to highlight our vulnerabilities to competitor institutions interstate or indeed our interstate governments. The top 100 status that the University of Adelaide has held for long periods of time and is sort of in and out of at the moment. The question mark is, without a merger, whether it is capable of staying there. Now, there is certainly different evidence put forward on that, but what we do know is that internationally other universities are increasingly investing in their own institutions. That is reducing the number of, or at least the proportion of undergraduate students who are seeking to go overseas as they have more and more institutions themselves, increasing up those ranking tables. The volume of people around the world who are undertaking university studies is increasing. The volume of places within universities is increasing. The volume of people who can read, the volume of people being educated full stop around the world is increasing dramatically. And within that context, it is harder and harder to be competitive for an institution such as the University of Adelaide or indeed any of our others. I note that Flinders University is doing really well. Flinders University is increasing up the rankings despite those challenges, and over the last few years its performance in attracting research grants has also increased. I think if some of those achievements Flinders University has been able to do over the last 5 years were reflected broadly, then we'd all be very proud. But the point I'm getting to there is we hope Flinders University will be in the national top 10 within a few years. That impact on Flinders is something that I think the government has failed to consider satisfactorily through the course of this debate, because the risk to the status quo for not being merged at Adelaide University that's been highlighted as a reason to support the merger, you can't think of the outcomes for the tertiary sector in South Australia on that basis and not also consider the outcomes for the tertiary sector in South Australia for Flinders as a result of the merger. We want Flinders to achieve that potential. We must see Flinders achieve that potential, just as we must see the merged university succeed as it goes ahead. And for that to happen, I urge the government over the next 2 years, during this term of government, to institute a research fund for Flinders University in the same way that this bill proposes to do for Adelaide University. We've said that the Liberal Party in government will do it. And the timing is fine here, because the urgency of the research fund is to support Adelaide University in the merger through its transition risks, and Flinders doesn't carry that risk. But the perpetual nature of the fund requires parity. Otherwise, in 50 years, 100 years, we'll have seen $2-3 billion invested from this fund in one university and nothing to the other one. And how can they possibly, over that period of time, be at the same level? That is setting up a long-term recipe for failure, or at least recipe for diminishment of one of our institutions at the expense of the other. And it can easily be fixed by signalling now, or signalling with the election of a Liberal government in 2 years, that Flinders will also receive a comparable investment from the state government to set it up for success, so that its research opportunities can also see it continue to rise, as we hope the new institution will rise on the same basis. The teaching of the students effectively, the student experience, are really important things to consider. I think I'll talk about students and undergraduates. There's a bit of a furphy that is broadly accepted and understood in society, but is probably inaccurate about the nature of these two institutions. Adelaide University was always seen as the sandstone institution, the prestigious institution. The expectation is that kids with higher ATARs go to Adelaide University, kids with lower ATARs go to the University of South Australia. The thing is, that's not entirely accurate, sir. I said before that a group of 8 badge on their parchment was something that would be appealing or attractive to many students from University of South Australia, but it actually doesn't drive many of their decisions. And the decisions that drive domestic students, as opposed to international students, are far broader than the ranking of their university. And actually the ATARs that the universities expect of their students are not so different as you would imagine. The report from the Joint Committee highlights 5 popular degree courses, and the comparison of minimum ATARs are worth having a look at. The minimum ATAR required for a Bachelor of Marketing by the University of Adelaide is, now this is, I think, last year, 68.5. The minimum ATAR for the University of South Australia is 65.45, a difference of 3. I can tell you from my own experience, a difference of 3 in a Year 12 exam context tells you absolutely nothing about a student's opportunities to succeed in their degree and in life. It tells you as much about how much sleep they were getting during their Year 12 exam period as anything else. And I'll tell you more than that. If a student's not getting sleep in their Year 12 exam period, or if they get sick in their Year 12 exam period, the difference in their ATAR will be a hell of a lot more than 3 from what their potential is. they're basically equivalent. A Bachelor of Accounting, the University of Adelaide, the ATAR is 61.5, University of South Australia is 60.4. Bachelor of Science, 61.3 and 56.45. The Bachelor of Engineering, Honours, Mechanical. Very, very esteemed course at University of Adelaide. You need 68.65. At University of South Australia, you need 68.3, a full 0.35 points less. This is not a sign where we have a system where all the top students are going to one institution and the students who couldn't quite get into that, between the band of 68.3 and 68.65, that band of 0.35 are going to University of South Australia. No. So what's happening is that students are making choices about which model of education appeals more to them, which campus is closer to home, which university was more appealing to them when they engaged through their student expo days, what the timetabling is like. I mean, goodness me, there are so many different factors that will go into a student's choice if they're a local student and what university they pursue. I was really interested to see the Bachelor of International Business. The minimum ATAR to get into a Bachelor of International Business at the University of Adelaide is 62.2. The minimum at the UniSA is 65.75, 3.5 higher at the University of South Australia than it is at the University of Adelaide. And look, there are courses that are offered at Adelaide that aren't offered at UniSA and vice versa, and there are some courses that have a broader gap in ATAR. But here's another point. Half of the students going to these institutions don't get in on their ATAR at all. There are a range of different methodologies that students arrive at university now, and not least the fact that there's probably a bigger disparity in terms of the preparedness of students for that university study amongst our international students than there is amongst our local domestic students here in South Australia. So look, I don't accept that there is a gulf between the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia in terms of the quality and the preparedness of the students. The student experience at the university, given that many of those students are currently choosing Adelaide Uni or UniSA for what they perceive the student experience to be at the moment, and we're replacing that choice with just having one university, that student experience will be really important. I spoke to a number of students. I spoke to the presidents of the Liberal clubs, we spoke to the presidents of the students' associations in the committee. I've spoken to a range of students who reached out, and there were a number who we reached out to. The things that they were interested in were not always what you might expect. One student talked to me about how excited they were about the powerhouse sporting teams that they felt would be able to achieve great things at the university games, and with the influx of extra students from which to draw their teams, they highlighted that the big unis do better because there are more potential sporting people. Now, that's not in itself a reason to support the bill or oppose it, just highlighting that not everything that's driving people's motivations and thinking about whether this is a good or a bad thing is going to be homogenous. One of the students highlighted that they didn't really like one of their lecturers, and they'd heard that the lecturer at the other university in that course was better. They were sorry that they weren't going to have that opportunity to work with them because the merger was still 3 years away. We had feedback from some students that they thought that the new university would be able to get rid of some of the old assumptions about what university education was. Can I tell you there's a level of risk in that too, but one of the challenges, and getting back to my point about the risks of status quo, is indeed in some of those courses that are really valuable in our universities, some of them are not seen as important by a number of students, not getting as many students studying them. This could be talking about languages, could be talking about different parts of performing arts, could be talking about classics. And I'll just highlight an example of why these things are important to teach. The Deputy Premier was Minister for Education for 2 years, Shadow Minister, maybe 3 years actually, Shadow Minister for a number of years, would have had many opportunities to talk to school students from around South Australia. I had such an opportunity a few weeks ago, and I was asked about the issue of the UN Security Council dealing with the situation in Israel and Palestine. And one of the students asked me a question. I don't want to get into that issue on this point, other than to say that one of the students asked me a question in a high school, a senior secondary course on politics, suggesting that there was no historical connection prior to 1947 between the Israeli people and the land on which the country of Israel now exists. And it was an illumination to them to discover that actually there's a historical connection going back to thousands and thousands of years, and it was in fact an occupying force in the Roman Empire, and indeed the decisions taken after an uprising in Judea that led to the diaspora of the Jewish people around Europe and Africa and Asia, and indeed the connection many of them had. But I guess some of those, what would have been considered at one point to be essential foundational parts of any liberal arts degree in a university, an understanding of history and understanding of classics being part of it, we don't expect in the modern world students who are focused on one area towards a particular profession, almost seen as a vocational calling towards medicine or engineering or accounting or anything else. We don't expect them to also pick up a classics elective or a history elective or whatever else. But it is important, in my view, within an institution that those disciplines continue to be supported, so that the research in those areas, the publishing in those areas, and the teaching of our students who choose to become, for example, our history teachers or our politics teachers, have the option of engaging with the past as well, and some of those key areas. Languages is one that is particularly challenging because for all of the energy that we put into our school students to encourage them to study languages, if they don't see a pathway at university for the further study of those languages to the level of expertise, then it's really hard to convince a Year 12 student to complete that language through to the end of their SACE. And all of these subjects, with lower numbers of student enrolment, are at risk unless the university leadership subsidises them or supports them in an ongoing fashion. Now, the university leaderships generally do as best they can, as far as I can tell. But the risk in these courses and these disciplines is much greater than those for whom there are always going to be ongoing numbers of students seeking professional qualifications that they need to do the jobs or careers that they want to do afterwards. And so I was comforted, not just through the responses of the Vice-Chancellors in the Joint Committee, but also in the responses that the Vice-Chancellors gave to the Liberal Party in response to our minority report in relation to their confidence that these less popular at this passing time courses would be better supported, would be less at risk in the context of a broader merged university with greater resources. The other area that can potentially benefit substantially from a merger that would otherwise be at risk, especially in the case of another pandemic or a significant event, the term black swan event became in regular use during the committee. I'm not sure if that was a new term by the universities or if I'm betraying my ignorance of something that everyone's been using for years. But at any rate, the Deputy Premier in her second reading response I encouraged to elucidate me as to whether she'd heard of the term before. But this idea of another black swan event, so let's just say something bad happens, whether or not there's a risk to courses with lower enrolments, whether there's a risk to the investments that don't make money in other areas. And a particular one is regional South Australia. Our regions in South Australia are so critically fundamental to who we are as a state and what we produce. But people living in regional South Australia face different challenges and different natures of challenges to people living in regions in other states. South Australia is the jurisdiction in the world with the largest disparity between the population centre of its major city and its second city. 1.7 odd million people in Adelaide, 25,000 or so in Mount Gambier is quite a difference. And we're a large state, sir. The risks and challenges facing students growing up in regional towns and the opportunities that they will have, what their parents or their schools must go through and invest in order to get them into the city to see different pathways, or to get people from the city to come to them and see what pathways might be out there, is entirely different from a student growing up in Ballarat or Bendigo or Mildura or Geelong. Regional Victoria or regional Queensland, where a significant proportion of the state's population does not live in its large capital city. Even in Western Australia, the enormous scale and space of Western Australia, the regional centres are much, much larger than ours. And so, getting a critical mass of students in a regional centre in South Australia, such as would make a university campus viable in and of itself, is a challenge. This is an area that we hope the Accord process will help in terms of redirecting some of the federal government's energy. We hope that it'll help service in a South Australian context. But with the decision to merge two of our state's three universities into two, the existing effort made by those universities is a critical question to contemplate whether there'll be a net benefit or a net loss or more of the same in the event of this merger. Now, the Flinders University effort in the regions is significant. Flinders University has made the point that with a portion of the scholarship fund for the new Adelaide institution going towards the regions, they think that they should have a cut of that too. I put that proposition to the Deputy Premier and invite her comment in her response. But the Flinders University in the regions. But the broader question is this new institution, what effort is it going to make in the regions, and how can we ensure that it will not just not dip, but indeed grow? We want to see Roseworthy continue and thrive. We want to see Mount Gambier and Whyalla continue and thrive. Waite isn't a regional campus, but I tell you what, if the work done at the Waite Institute isn't important for regional South Australia, then as Patrick Conlon once said in this chamber, I'll go he for Chasey. Investments are broader than that. Investments in the Eyre Peninsula and the APY lands even on a more modest scale. But the UniHub proposition is one that's really important. Take for example, Port Pirie, which is a UniHub that serves the member for Frome's electorate to a certain extent. That UniHub's fundamental tenet is not a South Australian university. Students from South Australian universities are able to access it and use its facilities and contribute to that small campus environment that they have there. And some student coursework is delivered there. But we'd like to see a lot more and a lot more engagement, particularly from our state institutions. The Spears Liberal government, if elected in the next election, will work with the universities. Flinders is we're completely eager to work with Flinders as well, and hopefully there'll be federal funding as well to support us. But we'll invest state money in not just ensuring that our existing offerings are able to be maintained on a net basis, but that there'll be new offerings and servicing new regions. That could be Clare and the Clare Valley, for example. It could be the southeast. It could be new or extended services in the Riverland. There's a range of different population centres where I think that there is definitely an opportunity for our region to be better served. It'll be interesting to see where the government's work with the new institution goes on the $20 million fund that they've identified to be added to the equity fund specifically to support regional South Australians. It could be that that goes to support scholarships. Of course, the original equity fund would also potentially support scholarships, including a significant number from regional South Australians who I would have thought would have been eligible. It could be that the government will work with the universities to invest in assistance programs for students who have to move to Adelaide. I hope that a portion of it will go on the sort of basis that I'm talking about here. It's programs that will assist students from regional South Australia to do a portion of their work in the regions. And there's a couple of reasons why this can work really well and will only be accentuated by the further investment that the Spears Liberal government will put in from 2026. But I just want to highlight the challenge first, and then the opportunity is there for the Deputy Premier to hopefully take up in the next period of time. When I was Education Minister, we put a lot of work into our country education strategy. One of the key issues seeking to resolve it is how do we attract people to not just take a job in the country so that they can get permanency with the department and then a right of return to the city, but how do we encourage them to engage in that community, succeed in that community, love that community, and encouraging people who might have the aptitudes and the dispositions to work and love working in the country to stay there. A lot of it is to do with the experience people have when they first arrive, and that experience really needs to happen at university to an extent as well. Helping people acclimatise in a town, make friends, get accustomed to the ways of the local area, get accustomed to the fact that the kids they're teaching, parents, are also the ones they're going to see in the local pub or the local restaurant on any given day. Now, one of the ways that you can see a higher level of success for a teacher, for example, to want to work in a country or to succeed when they get there, or a nurse or doctor or any other number of professions that we need in the country, is if it's a country person to start with. When you have the experience that you're growing up in a town or a regional community and you know you need to leave that region in order to fulfil your educational opportunities, then one of the risks is that you do that at the age of, say, 18, finish school, move to town, stay at St Mark's, go to uni, make your friends, build your life in town. If there's an opportunity to do a portion of that study, especially the first year or two of a degree in your region, in somewhere in the country, then that encourages people to think about their region as being the destination for their education, and town just as being somewhere that helps facilitate its completion. We would like to see more kids, not everyone wants to do that, some of these kids are loving coming into town and very excited about it, but we want to see more kids able to access their educational opportunities while still living in their regions if that's what they want to do. Now, the way in which the university seeks to build its courses in a modular way should actually make this easier, and it should make the model where you have a uni hub and a regional centre where a student can access significant portions of the course, or indeed they could do it from home or work, because one of the things we want to do is encourage more people in work to have the opportunity to pick up further skills or qualifications or degrees. They can do that while living in their community, while still contributing to their community. We don't have this dearth of people as they go off into town to study. A student who's still living in their hometown, able to access education either partly or wholly through a uni hub, is able to continue their contribution to the local sporting team, their local volunteering, their local part-time work, and indeed they don't need the same level of financial support in order to take up a place in a share flat or university accommodation or otherwise accommodation in the city. There are many benefits to providing more opportunities for students to study while still in a region. But it will require some state investment, because it's clear that without the state government having previously taken a leading role in engaging with our South Australian institutions, that hasn't happened to the extent that we'd like it to. I have great optimism that the campus at Mount Gambier will increase and flourish in the years ahead. Whyalla, I was challenged a couple of years ago when Whyalla students who wanted to study education had courses withdrawn. This is, I think, when the Deputy Premier might have even been the Education Minister at the time, and I recall she and I think it was her, both writing to the Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Australia at the time and getting these answers about the number of students not being there to support that education course. At any rate, there are challenges to regional delivery, but we certainly want to do what we can to overcome those challenges and see the net offering increase, not just stay the same, because at the moment, frankly, it's not enough. And at the moment, when it comes to uni hubs, I'd love to see an anchor tenant be one of those South Australian universities. As 2 weeks ago I was making the commitment for the opposition, if we form government, to deliver on this uni hub, I was also very much encouraged and appreciative of the Vice-Chancellors of UniSA and Adelaide Uni for putting in writing that they too would be eager to work with any government that wants to invest in that, and they are absolutely open to being an anchor tenant. I'm certain that with the right level of support, subject to student interest and everything else that needs to be worked through, Flinders would as well, because their commitment to the regions is also really strong. So, on balance, this merger proposal does present some opportunities for regional South Australia. and that informs our thinking in supporting the bill as well. It's not to be assumed that it will have the benefit. The Deputy Premier may point to the objects or the functions where it talks about the importance of this university serving the whole state, but ultimately, in its delivery, it requires resourcing, it requires culture, it requires intentionality of the leadership of the university. Having that has been good, and certainly on our side of the chamber, we'll be eager to work with all of our institutions on, if we're in government, to ensure that that is an opportunity that is delivered. In relation to Flinders University, I've spoken at some length about that as I've been going through, so I won't spend an enormous time, certainly not after lunch. I don't expect to be going back to it. But the two perpetual funds that this bill creates, the equity fund and the research fund, these are, of course, funds that will support the university in doing things that the university is already doing. Now, the point has been made, accepted by the government, that Flinders University offers courses that the University of Adelaide, the merged university, will not do. It would be to the detriment of a student who wanted to study to be a paramedic, for example, if a scholarship was available at Adelaide Uni funded by the state to do something else that then dissuaded them from doing that calling. That would be a detriment to the state. And the government has got on board and is committed, I think it was $40 million towards an equivalent research fund, equity fund for Flinders University. That money won't go to benefit the university necessarily, as the money, I assume, at Adelaide University won't go to benefit the university. It will go to the students, to ensure that those students who might be first in family, who might be from disadvantaged or vulnerable backgrounds, who might be in a circumstance where without a scholarship, the level of work that they would need to do to support themselves through university would potentially reduce their risks of succeeding at university and therefore thriving and achieving the contribution that we want them to contribute to our state. So the equity funds, make no bones about it, are going to be of benefit to students and to our state. The funding doesn't go directly to the universities, but the universities probably would be seeking to create them, and they do make commitments like this out of their own resources, but having the perpetual fund reduces the risk that they might be denuded in the years ahead. So it's good that there's been an equity fund set up for Flinders, or being an equity fund set up for Flinders as well. I'd be interested in the Minister's second reading responses to the mechanism that is being proposed to create that for Flinders. But research going to one institution and not the other is where we come back to. I accept at their word, the Vice-Chancellors of the University of South Australia and University of Adelaide, when they say that they're not looking to poach from Flinders top-level researchers. But if we are looking at the 6 areas of a special focus that the university is taking for high levels of research, and these will be in areas from defence to the arts even, and all of those areas. There are people at Flinders who do those areas as well. And whether it's the top flight researchers that might seek to be part of the new institution because they're offering more money, or if it's even a lower level researcher or a recent graduate from Flinders who wants to join the team of the new university because, again, there's all this state government investment that's going in to support these new research areas. Then if that if that graduate or if that researcher or if that top flight researcher alike, if any of them are coming from Flinders, then that's not bringing a net benefit to the state with state government money. That's state government money supporting one institution over the other. Now, it doesn't require the merged institution to be seeking to poach for that to happen as an unintended consequence. And it would only be reasonable, therefore, for Flinders University to have access to the same level of support, not necessarily the same dollar amount in terms of the capital of the fund. Flinders University will probably be about 30 to 35% the size of the new institution. In terms of its research funding and support, it would probably be in the order of 40%. You can pick a figure. The Flinders University certainly has. But the choices that you make there the key thing is whether or not you do a fund that will enable state government support to ensure that all of our university sector flourishes through both of our universities benefiting from this state investment. Over the course of the next 10 years, this investment for Adelaide University will be in well over $100 million, potentially over $200 million, depending on how the fund performs. Over the course of 20, 30 years, you're starting to talk about some money that will be transformational. And over a couple of generations, we're talking about enormous amounts of money. And for that to go to one and not the other is a risk that I think to our sector, through Flinders missing out, that I don't think is in the interest of the people of South Australia, and the Spears Liberal government will therefore invest in Flinders University. But I encourage the government to rethink this over the course of the next period and do this work now, because it will only be to their credit if they do, and we will welcome them if they do. Sir, I seek leave to continue my remarks.
Leave is sought. Leave granted. Yes, granted.